Good evening, everyone. I'm Carolyn Best, Director of Arts and Letters Live here at the Dallas Museum of Art, and I'm delighted to welcome you all to hear William Middleton talk about his book, Double Vision, about Dominique and John de Menil. And if you haven't yet purchased a copy of the book, you can do that after the event in the museum store and then have William sign it at the book signing. He'd be happy to answer questions from the audience after his presentation, so if you'd like to ask a question, feel free to raise your hand and a staff member will bring you a wireless microphone. And if you'll stand when posing your question, that will help William spot you in the audience and address you directly. Arts and Letters Live is supported by our annual season supporters, the K. Catarula Endowment for the Literary and Performing Arts, and the McGee Foundation Arts and Letters Live Endowment Fund at the Dallas Museum of Art. Additional major support is provided by the Hirsch Foundation. The Fairmont Hotel Dallas is the exclusive hotel partner for the 2018 Arts and Letters Live season. Promotional support is provided by KERA. Exclusive magazine sponsor is D Magazine. Special thanks to the Arts and Letters Live staff and volunteers and to Richard Serrano for recording for Art This Week Productions. Now it's my pleasure to welcome Laura Hartman, who will introduce William Middleton. Laura is the Associate Paintings Conservator here at the DMA. She received her Master's of Science degree from the Winterthur University of Delaware program in art conservation with a focus on paintings conservation, and spent her last year of school as a graduate intern first at the Prado in Madrid, followed by the Mauritshuis Royal Picture Gallery in the Netherlands. She completed another fellowship at the Yale University Art Galleries in New Haven, Connecticut, and in 2013 she was awarded the Andrew W. Mellon Fellowship in Paintings Conservation at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. Please join me in welcoming Laura Hartman.
I want to first thank you all for joining us this evening. I have the great pleasure of introducing William Middleton, who will be speaking on his highly anticipated 750-page tome, Double Vision, the Unerring Eye of Art World Avatars Dominique and John de Menil. I, a longtime lover of the Menil and previous resident of Houston, had been anticipating this book greatly. This biography is truly a masterpiece and so much more than just biography. It is also a major accomplishment, having just been released after an almost decade-long journey for the author. The Menil collection as a whole, as many of you know, is an incredibly special place and a foundational institution for Texas. In its subtle and beautiful atmosphere, the Menil has served as a beacon for many generations and many more to come. William has been able to capture the core of the incredible family responsible for the Menil's unique and beautiful collection, and their lasting impact on Texas and its arts. If you do not have a copy yet, I highly recommend getting a hard copy because the images included are fantastic. They're beautiful color illustrations that let you walk into the spaces inhabited by the Menils, giving you a greater sense for the couple and their truly unique eye. William Middleton himself is a highly accomplished journalist, author, editor, and scholar. Coming from Kansas, he ascended the magazine publishing world of New York City and Paris. He became a Texan when he moved to Houston in 2004, where the de Menils entered his life and would encompass his work for the next decade. Although William is speaking on his book, I hope he also shares some of his personal experiences working with the de Menils and his own history and an ongoing relationship with the collection and family, which is fantastic and incredibly interesting. Please join me in welcoming William Middleton.
Thank you for such a warm introduction. I feel like first I need to ask for a sort of truce tonight between Dallas and Houston, because I'm going to be saying a lot about Houston. And I know that won't be a problem here. But I did want to ask, can I just get a show of hands? How many people know the Menil collection? How many know the de Menils? And you've been to the museum? Okay. Okay, great. So I wanted to begin just by telling you a little about why this book. I lived in Paris for a long time, for about 10 years. So I've been very sensitive to French history and the French language and French culture. And I had known, when I was living in New York, there was an article done in the 1980s in the New York Times called The Medici of Modern Art. And it was about the Dominios and the family and their collection in New York and in Houston. So I knew that down in Texas there was this funny little connection with France, but I'd never seen it. I knew Dallas much better, but I didn't know Houston. And so I went there in the fall of 2000 and saw what the Dominios had created. I saw the Menil collection, the Rothko Chapel, the Cy Twombly Gallery, Richmond Hall, and like many, I was blown away by what they had done. But I remember it was particularly at the house, because at that point it was it was November 2000, and she had died at December 31st, 1997. So the house was exactly as it was when they had lived there. And I remember so clearly being in the house with this incredibly, with this rigorous architecture by Philip Johnson from 1948 to 1950, and this really kind of voluptuous interior by Charles James, and this extraordinary collection of really dense and layered and eclectic art. And I remember being in that space and looking out and thinking, how did this happen? That this couple came here from Paris in 1941 and did all of this, and why here? What is this place? this place called Houston. And I want to tell you a little bit about what I discovered about Houston. And I don't want to have a lot of readings from the book tonight, but there are a couple that I wanted to point out. And I want to begin with one that kind of describes what Houston was like. And I begin by saying, in Houston, there was a time not so long ago when even the air was thick with oil. In the summer of 1941, when Dominique and Jean Dominio first arrived, there were working wells scattered all over town. In the city and its surrounding counties, there were more than 100 oil fields and 7,000 producing wells. The city limits extended no further than 5 miles from the center of downtown. Houston is now the 4th largest city in the United States and stretches for 30 to 40 miles in every direction. Its industry was based on cattle, cotton, rice, construction, and since the turn of the century, petroleum. Although it was located on the frontier with the West, it also had in those days a definite southern character. Before the war, it was known as the Magnolia City. As Dominique described the place they first encountered, quote, Houston was a provincial town with a pioneering mentality and a lingering sense of southern gentility. Founded in 1836, Houston had been the largest city in Texas since 1930, but compared with Dallas, its North Texas rival, the place was shiny and new. There was one institution of higher learning, the Rice Institute, and one museum, the Museum of Fine Arts, opened only 16 years before the Dominios arrived. The symphony played in an Art Deco structure that it shared with a local rodeo and livestock show. During World War II, as a way to sell war bonds, someone had the idea, unconventional to say the least, of pairing a performance of the Houston Symphony with a night of professional wrestling. According to one observer, quote, the orchestra, conducted by Ernst Hoffman, sat on the stage in formal dress. The wrestlers, who performed in a ring in the center of the auditorium, were hardly dressed at all. More than 4,000 Houstonians attended, and it raised $1 million. Quote, at one point, a bloodied 230-pound wrestler leaped on stage and began conducting the orchestra. It said, Houston's image as a cultural center was a long time changing, and the smirks must have stretched all the way from Dallas. So I wanted to give you a sense before we get into what the Dominios did in Houston and why. I want to give you a sense of who they were. Dominique Schlumberger, to use her maiden name, her family story begins essentially in Alsace. And that was interesting for me just in terms of research because, as I mentioned, I lived in France and I certainly know the French history, but what exactly is Alsace and is it Germany, is it France? And it was very interesting to really learn more about the region. And the Schlumberger family, more than just Alsatian, were an Alsatian Protestant dynasty. Her great-great-grandfather founded a company called Nicolas Schlumberger and Company that still exists. He founded it in 1808. It's one of the most important manufacturers of textile machinery in the world. And it was, although the family was prominent 11 generations before the birth of Dominique, this great-great-grandfather, Nicolas Schlumberger, is the one who really gave them their first great fortune. The Schlumberger family is connected with another French Protestant dynasty, but this one is a sort of intellectual and political dynasty. This is a man named Francois Keizo, who was born just before the Revolution and died just after the Franco-Prussian War. And this is a place that he had in Normandy that's called the Val Richer, which is a remarkable family chateau that is still in the family. It's still Dominique's branch of the Schlumberger family. Francois Keizo was under Louis Philippe, who was the last king of France. He was essentially his prime minister from 1830 to 1848, and he was also a leading historian. He was considered one of the first great French historians. He was a remarkable statesman, a remarkable ambassador. He renovated the chateau, and it's still considered one of the best examples of Louis Philippe design in existence. This is the salon. This is a stairway. This is a gallery. Now, one thing that's a little interesting is that French Protestants were very kind of severe, and Dominique always said there were no collectors in her family because collecting art was seen as something that was somewhat frivolous, not serious. And it's true that there were no significant art collectors in her family, but I believe that you can't have grown up at the Val Richer and not be sensitive to sort of beautiful things and beautiful objects and history, you know. So Francois Keizo had a son who died, and his eldest daughter had 2 daughters. And after Francois Keizo died, she had a hard time keeping the chateau together. It was a very big property, and this is Francois Keizo at the Val Richer. But she had a hard time keeping the chateau together, and there was the concern that she was going to have to sell it. She had 2 daughters only, and they didn't really have a dowry because she didn't have a dime. And they would meet prospective suitors, and everyone would say, well, you know, what's the dowry? And she would say, well, there is no dowry. And so she wasn't very successful in finding partners for them. And then finally a matchmaker said, I have these 2 brothers from Alsace, and as for the dowry, they don't really care. So her 2 daughters were married to the 2 Schlumberger brothers. So Dominique's grandfather, Paul Schlumberger, married the granddaughter of Francois Keizo. And thanks to the Schlumberger fortune, the chateau was maintained. And this is the only chateau that I know like this in France, actually. It's super interesting because her grandfather, Paul Schlumberger, and Marguerite, because they were the ones who received the chateau, and he was the one who funded its restoration. After they died in the 1920s, the chateau was reserved for all the descendants of Paul and Marguerite Schlumberger. So it's essentially like a timeshare. That all of the descendants pay in, and they buy, you know, a share in the Val Richer, and they have the right to go there. And it's still a family compound. You know, I know many chateaux that are still in the family, but none that have been done just like this. It's a super democratic way to do it, and it's something that really preserves the heritage of this branch of the Schlumberger family. So this is Dominique's father, Conrad Schlumberger, and her mother, Louise Delpache, also from a very prominent Protestant clan from southern France. And Conrad Schlumberger, there are a lot of interesting people in the Dominio story, in the Dominio and Schlumberger families, but Conrad Schlumberger has to be about the most impressive one, I think. He graduated at the top of his class of Polytechnique, which is a really important school in Paris. He was a physicist. He was a war hero. He had this idea before World War that he could use electricity to measure what lay below the ground. And it was a time when the technology of electricity was still relatively new. And he thought that, that he could take subsurface readings using electricity. And the idea was to be able to use it for prospecting, to find gold, to find other minerals like that. And before the war, before World War I, Dominique was with her father traipsing around the fields of Normandy and the Val Richer, experimenting, seeing if this could work. And then the war came, and after the war, his father, Paul Schlumberger, funded his company. And it was first called the Electrical Prospecting Company. And it turned out that it worked, that you could take the subsurface reading. And many here will probably know that World War I was also an important moment because petroleum became very important. And after the war, it turned out that not only did this process work, but that it could find more than just gold or copper, but also it worked to find oil. And within 10 years or 15 years, fairly quickly, it turned out that almost anyone, anywhere in the world, when they drilled for oil, used Schlumberger. So it's still the world's largest oil services company with about 120,000 employees around the world and $25 billion in annual sales. And it all sprang from the mind of her father. And Dominique was with him every step of the way, and he was someone who was he was just an incredibly strong figure. I've read so many letters between them. You know, when one time she was a teenager and she was in the Alps, and he said, he wrote, your mother and I are swimming in ignorance about your future movements and plans. He said, are those to be dictated only by the size of your budget and how far your feet can take you? You know, so he was always very loving, but very firm. You know, it's like Conrad Schlumberger was the kind of father who would make you sit up a little straighter. So this is young Dominique with her mother, her father, her older sister in their house in Paris, in the Saint-Germain. This is young Dominique in the center here, in front of the Val Richer, with her mother, her aunt, her cousins. Dominique with her mother. This is also a nice reminder that I read a letter when Dominique's relationship was new with Jean, and she talked about her very early memories in Paris between the war, and she talked about the streets being clogged with carriages. And it's extraordinary to me that her life began, you know, in that world, you know, and it ended in 1997 in Houston, Texas. But I mean, just this was the Belle Epoque, you know, and that's when those were her first memories. This is Dominique later with Nika, the family dachshund, at the Val Richer. This is Jean de Menil. Now, the de Menil clan was a much different sort of family. Catholic, very Catholic, and very sort of militaristic. This is Jean, young, dressed as a soldier of Louis XV. They were also very royalist, the Dominio family. His great-great-grandfather was a colonel under Napoleon, and he spent about 25 years on leading his troops on battlefields across Europe. He was ennobled by Napoleon. He was given the title the Baron de Menil. And the family had married into the ancient aristocracy at a couple of different junctures, but they were Napoleonic nobility and of the military. And so there was a certain militaristic intensity about the Dominio family. So this is during World War I. This is Jean on the left. His two older brothers, Marcel and Emmanuel, in uniform. His father, who was also a colonel, and his younger brother, Patrice. And his two older brothers would be killed during World War I. And so his younger brother, Patrice, was destined to be a priest. He became a Dominican priest. So Jean became the member of the family on whom the entire future sort of rested. There's another fascinating point about the family. Around the time Jean was born, there was a distant family member who got involved in a swindle, essentially, and Georges de Menil, Jean's father, the Colonel Georges de Menil, decided to protect the family name and honor some documents that this distant cousin had forged. He had forged his name and the name of his brother-in-law on some documents, and he honored them so that the family name wouldn't be dragged into some kind of scandal, and essentially bankrupted the family. They had had quite a fortune before. They lost what was today the equivalent of $25 million. And there were 4 children who were born before Jean de Menil and 3 after Jean. And this sort of financial ruin happened right around the time that he was born. And so he was brought up in much more reduced circumstances than any other members of his family. And because the 2 older brothers were killed, it was sort of up to him to restore luster to the family name. And he was someone who was very interested in the art of his day. He was very interested in culture. He was very interested in cinema. His family was quite conventional, and he was someone who was much more, as I say, as the 1920s gave way to the 1930s, Jean began to reflect more of his family's characteristics. Both his mother and his father gave him an appreciation of faith, although Jean's was softer, less dogmatic. Much like his father, his 2 older brothers, and his great-grandfather, he had a militaristic passion and a sense of duty. His rise at the bank, because he was a very successful young banker when he met Dominique, showed him to be an effective businessman and leader. And there were cultural stimuli as well. He had a love for music and literature that had been encouraged by his mother. But Jean took these characteristics, many rather conventional, and turned them into something that was more robust. As his older sister Mirez said, although he still cared very much about his family, he no longer felt in harmony with us. He was comfortable in a more open cultural environment. Jean began to transcend his heritage, defining his own track. He engaged in the cultural life of the city, Paris, both high and low, and he developed what his family had been lacking, a sensitivity to what was modern and meaningful. Jean also took a trip around the world when he was 21 years old, which was an extraordinary experience for him. And I write that it's long been held that Parisians had a difficult time moving beyond the borders of their own country. There was a saying, for example, that the French didn't travel well except in exile. But Jean's 6-month trip around the world helped him to break with that tradition. It opened his mind enormously, Dominique de Menil said of the experience. So between his trip around the world and his military service, which was done in Morocco, he was able to see the world from a much broader perspective. He began to evolve into an internationalist and a humanist. Quote, "If I try to sum up Jean's ideal, I keep coming back to words such as honesty and truthfulness and brotherhood," Dominique later pointed out. He himself started in life at the bottom of the ladder. He had vowed that if he would ever get to a position of authority, that he would not forget those who see things from below, those who are never given a voice. After his trip, Jean did not return to the family home empty-handed. He had acquired many objects on his expeditions. From Africa, he brought back ceremonial masks, as well as a large rug made of bark. In Tahiti, he brought records of traditional music. From Polynesia, floral wrap skirts that he wore over his swimsuit at the beach. And he was eager to share his exotic finds with family and friends. So by 1930, this newly minted baron, because he had received the title, had managed to turn himself into quite a distinctive figure. He developed an engaged view of the world and was fulfilling his quest for success. Deeply religious, he had also begun to have an intense connection with the inventive arts that were around him in post-war Paris. These were the earliest seeds of a connoisseur, of a patron, that would be brought to life in the most spectacular way on the other side of the world. Dominique and Jean de Menil met in the spring of 1930 at a ball in Versailles. It was love at first sight. It was a coup de foudre, as they say. And They spoke with one another into the night. They talked so much that all of the other guests had left, and they'd missed the train back to Paris, and the host had to give Jean a ride back to his own place. Because it was impossible that Jean be given a ride back with Dominique and her sister. But the relationship began immediately, and they were married the following spring. But there were a lot of obstacles to overcome. He was very, as I said, he came from a profoundly Catholic family. She came from a profoundly Protestant family. But it was something that they faced and overcame. This is their apartment in Paris in 1933. They hired an architect to renovate the apartment. It doesn't look like so much today. I mean, it looks like fairly simple, but at the time it was pretty radical. They took out all of the ceiling moldings. It's a 19th century building. It's the upper floor of apartments where her parents lived and where she had been born. And they took out the ceiling moldings. They added some kind of machine age elements. And as you can see, this is a very simple kind of banquette. And white walls, white curtains, white rug, red monarch butterflies inset into the wall, zebra skin. And it all looks very simple today, but it was very radical at the time. And this is a corner of that room, the salon. And it's interesting to note that there are two pieces of art that we see here. On the left is a Russian icon, St. George slaying the dragon, that Dominique had bought in 1933 on a trip to Moscow with her father, a business trip. And on the right is a portrait of Othello by Christian Bérard, a French contemporary artist. The sofa is a new design by Pierre Barbe, as are the bookcases. But what's interesting for me about these two pieces is from the very beginning, they're interested in Eastern Christian art. She would end up amassing a very important collection of Byzantine icons and Russian icons. And they're interested in contemporary art. And also, because of Othello, they're interested it just says a lot to me about the point of view of the Dominials right from the beginning. There were works, however, that did not interest them. They had hoped to get a work for the dining room, and they were told that Max Ernst painted birds. So they were introduced to Max Ernst, and they found him really charming. But they went to his studio, and they saw the kind of birds that Max Ernst painted, and they were a little horrified. So Jean de Menil said, well, why don't we have him paint a portrait of you? They saw a portrait that he had in his studio, and said, why don't we have him paint a portrait? And so they did. And a very funny story about how it was lost for a year or two. It was taken to the framer, and the Dominials forgot about it, and the framer was right around the corner from their apartment, but it was on a street that they never passed. And eventually, a local priest saw it and said, well, that's Madame de Menil. And so they took it to them, and they looked at the painting again, and they still didn't like it. And so they wrapped it up, and they put it on top of an armoire, and they forgot about it, and it was there through World War II. And it wasn't until after the war, when their eyes had been opened to modern art, essentially in New York, that they looked at this with an entirely new eye, and they understood its importance. And they brought it back to America, and it's remained a key part of the collection. This is a bark cloth that they bought very early also. It was the first piece that the Dominials bought that was in a museum exhibition in 1935. So a New Guinea bark cloth. Again, immediately they're interested in other cultures. That part of that is John's influence. And so their lives in between the wars in Paris were fascinating. It was one of the most exciting moments in art history. And they were a young couple who were interested in art, but they weren't major collectors. They had a couple of pieces, they started to be interested, but they were absorbing art, they were going to exhibitions, they were seeing museums, of course, but art was not a priority. Belief, spirituality, some of their early engagement with the Catholic Church, looking at reforms that would appear in Vatican II, were more important for them in those years than art. But the war came, and there was great concern that Jean Dominique joined Schlumberger reluctantly in 1938. There was another thing about him. Another thing about the book. It began as a biography of Dominique Dominio, and I was told by the children, there are 5 Dominio children, they all live in New York, and I was told fairly quickly that Jean Dominique was very important to everything that they had done, because he died in 1973, and she went on to live until the end of 1997, almost 25 years after he died. He's been forgotten, and no one really understands his significance. So the book it had to become a sort of double biography. And the children were absolutely right. But my first reaction was like, gosh, didn't he just kind of marry the boss's daughter? Because he worked for Schlumberger, and it's like, nothing wrong with marrying the boss's daughter, but I wasn't sure how interesting he was. But as soon as I started reading his correspondence, as soon as I started learning more about him, I understood how important he was to what they did. And she always made it clear throughout her life that she wouldn't have been doing what she did if it had not been for the example of Jean Dominique. So he's been he's a great element of this book, and he's been fascinating to get to know. There's a moment in Bucharest in 1940, because Jean went to Romania in the fall of 1939. Romania is the only kind of oil-producing country in Europe, so he went there for kind of his first assignment with Schlumberger, and Dominique went with him, because, of course, she knew the science of Schlumberger as well as anyone. And they were there in their little apartment in Bucharest, and at this point, France had declared war against Germany, but nothing had happened yet at the beginning of 1940. And there was a little organ grinder who appeared on the street below and to play some music. And so the Dominios went over to the window, and they engaged with him, and I assumed that they spoke French, because France and Romania have a long history, and there were a lot of Francophiles in Romania. But in some way, he found out that they were French, and so he struck up La Marseillaise. He started playing the French national anthem. And Jean Dominique threw some money down to him, and he said, "I'll give you 3 times more than that if you go and play the same song underneath the windows of the German embassy." So he was someone of tremendous flair, someone who loved kind of shaking things up. They went to America in 1941. They arrived in New York in June of 1941. And there was someone who they had known in Paris before World War II named Father Couturier. And Father Couturier was a really fascinating figure who felt like the Catholic Church had distanced itself from modern art. Particularly in France, there was absolutely no connection between any kind of significant artist. Not a significant artist had not been commissioned for any kind of church since the 19th century. And that one wasn't particularly successful. But Father Couturier believed very much in modern art, and he had this very strong connection with artists. He went on to build the Matisse Chapel in Vence, and he also did this remarkable Notre-Dame de Champs, which is the Le Corbusier chapel in the Alps. So he did a series of churches that used work by contemporary artists. And so he was a remarkable figure, a former artist, but he was passionate about art. And he was really essential to the Dominios' education about art. So he was in New York. Jean Dominique ran into him again, and started going to the Museum of Modern Art with him, to the Metropolitan Museum. Dominique arrived in New York, and they all went together. And as I write, the Dominios benefited from Couturier's connection to artists and the still nascent art world in America. His influence was decisive in their education. As Dominique recalled, when we did not like something, he made us see more of it. I remember our first visit to the Museum of Modern Art. We were just beginning to appreciate Cubist paintings. In front of a Mondrian, I said, now, this is going too far. You can't pretend that those few rectangles are beautiful. Father Couturier insisted, however. He said to Dominique and Jean, you may not like it, but it is serious, and you have to take it seriously. And soon enough, Mondrian became a very meaningful artist for the Dominios. In fact, this is the first work by Mondrian that they purchased in the early 50s. And Dominique felt so strongly about him that once she was asked what work she would try to save if their house was on fire. And she decided on a very specific piece by Mondrian, this small pencil sketch on an envelope that was meant as a study for a future painting. For her, the tiny Mondrian was a treasure of reflection and knowledge of simplicity and beauty. So thanks to Father Couturier, they began to understand modern art. And also they were seeing works that they weren't seeing in museums in Paris. You know, none of these great modernists were on view in museums in Paris, so they were exposed to much more than they'd seen. And there's another element of their wartime education that I think is fascinating, and that is, you know, we think now, when we think back to World War II, we know how it ends, but in the middle of it, the Dominios are French. Their country has fallen to the Nazis. They're in New York, and they're looking at this incredible art. You know, and Father Couturier went to visit Alfred Barnes in Philadelphia to see the Barnes collection. And when he wrote to Dr. Barnes to thank him, he made it clear what it meant to see such stirring examples of Paris art in the midst of World War II. And this is Father Couturier's letter. Quote, at a time when all that is good in the world is threatened, it is, for someone from France, a great joy and a great comfort to be reminded that what one's country has given to the world, that is the most pure, will never be at the mercy of a military defeat. Seeing that helps bring hope for the future. So seeing these great French modernists, or great work by modern artists who had lived in France, was incredibly meaningful for them. And then I just want to give one other point of Father Couturier, and this was an essential element of their education from him, is that Father Couturier also played a major role in freeing Dominique from some of the more limiting aspects of her French Protestant background. He helped her to understand, and it was a realization that was essential to their development as collectors and patrons, that the Dominios' multiplying fortune meant that they had a responsibility to give back. Art was not something frivolous, nor was it an egotistical act meant only for their own enjoyment or something used as a monument to themselves. Instead, Couturier argued, they should be acquiring great works and allowing them to enrich the lives of others, just as they themselves had been enriched in the galleries and museums of New York. As Dominique recalled, quote, Father Couturier was an ascetic, but he certainly was not a Puritan. He cured me of my puritanical block against collecting. He made it an obligation for us, a moral obligation, to buy good paintings, if and when we could afford it. There's always that little ad there from Dominique. Jean wasn't too concerned about that. So Father Couturier was really important to their education. And there were others. Alexander Yolis was a remarkable figure who was a dealer who the Dominios essentially funded. He was a former ballet dancer, very kind of extravagant figure, and all of their great, not all of them, many of their great surrealist paintings came from him. Many of their Magrittes, many of their Max Ernst. He was a remarkable dealer in Paris, New York, and he essentially became the Dominio's in-house dealer. But he and Couturier did not like one another very much. They were very kind of different figures. But it's fascinating to me that the Dominios incorporated both points of view. They didn't take one or the other. They incorporated both. And this work by Matisse is a good example of Eolus's influence in their collection. It was a work, post-Fauvis work by Matisse that the Dominios saw in Eolus's gallery in New York and took home and decided they didn't really like that much. So they took it back to the gallery, and it was there, and Dr. Barnes came in. And he saw it, and he wanted to buy it. And he said to Eolus, gosh, I really would like that. And Eolus said, oh, I'm sorry, it's already promised to the Dominios. And, which is, of course, not true, but Eolus was a tremendous liar. He said, no, I'm sorry, it's already promised to the Dominios. So he left. Dr. Barnes left, and he came back a little later, and he said, you know what, I really want that painting. He said, he said, I would trade one of my later Matisse for that. And Eolus said, no, I really can't. It's promised to the Dominios. And he said, why don't you write in the guest book how you feel about that? And so he according to Eolus, he wrote, this is the most beautiful Matisse that I've ever seen, signed Dr. Barnes. And the Dominios saw that, and they're like, we'll take that. So they were learning, right? And this, of course, remains an important part of the collection. So the Dominios arrive in Paris, essentially after the war. They settle in Paris. They live with their family in a charming little house that was, a traditional sort of salt box that had been built a few years before. And they start to have a larger family. They have 5 children. They start to have more works of art, and they decide that they need something else. And so they decide they want to build a new house. But it was important, there were several factors in that decision. I mean, not just the need for a new house or a larger house, but they felt like they wanted to make a statement. They wanted to make a statement in Houston. And one of the things I say is, surprisingly, for a major city, there was very little significant architecture in Houston. There were certainly some handsome buildings at Rice University, a series of neo-Gothic, Romanesque, Byzantine structures constructed before World War I by a Boston architect, and in parts of the city, some very gracious houses. But there were no skyscrapers by Louis Sullivan, no public monuments by McKim, Mead, and White, no 1920s prairie houses by Frank Lloyd Wright. The first great example of modernism in Houston, Mies van der Rohe's Cullinan and Hall for the Museum of Fine Arts, would not be constructed until 1958. So as they settled into their lives in Houston, the Dominios became aware of this missing element. There was nothing particularly exciting to look at in those days, Dominique noted. Cullinan and Hall had not been built, there was not even a nice building downtown, and it took away much of my pleasure to know that the best houses were only copies. Dominique and Jean lived in one of those imitations, a perfectly handsome salt box, but the traditional houses in the city, no matter how lovely many were not inspiring. But it was precisely that lack, in fact, that inspired the Dominios. As Dominique later explained, quote, where there is nothing, we need to start creating. Houston has the means and the power. It is important they not be used for things that are inopportune or kitsch. So the Dominios decided to make a modernist statement, and they decided also that it was important to hire a significant architect. And they chose Philip Johnson, who at that point was young, but he was affiliated with the Museum of Modern Art. He was designing his glass house in New Canaan. It's often been said that this was his first commission, which is not entirely true. There are other houses that he was working on that were completed before this was completed. But he always said that the Dominios were his first clients, his best clients, the clients that brought me all my other clients. But he was quite a charmer too, Philip Johnson. So The house itself is long and lean, brick in the front with glass entrance, glass and steel in the back. They wanted it to be indoors and outdoors. It's built around a central atrium filled with tropical plants. But Philip Johnson wanted the house to be like the glass house was. He wanted the interior to be as pure as the exterior. He could imagine, as Dominique said, a Barcelona chair on a square coffee table on a musty-colored rug. And Dominique and Jean, in particular, felt that they could get bored with that. And so Jean said, why don't we talk with that guy who's been doing some dresses for you? So there was a designer named Charles James, who's considered one of the best fashion designers that America has ever produced. And they hired him to work on the interior. And what Dominique said that Charles James did, which is really interesting, is that into this rigorous international style architecture, where it was all about the straight line and the right angle, that Charles James introduced the curve. So he designed these new pieces. This is a lip sofa. He introduced this 19th century Belter furniture. There's a 19th century, or excuse me, there's a new piece that he designed, a chaise longue. Dominique wearing Charles James. Jean on the same chaise longue, photographed by Henri Cartier-Bresson, reading the morning paper. And then as the house progressed, it began to become more and more dense, as I said earlier. So you see the curves, the 18th century desk here, the curving piano, the Belter furniture, this red velvet sofa that came from Charles James, the lip sofa now over here. But the eclectic collection of art, the 17th century Cordoba leather screen, the Gothic sculpture, the Benin rooster, the African sculpture in back, the major Magritte painting over the piano, a De Chirico over the fireplace. In the entry there on the right, there are two Fernandez paintings that were very important for Dominique, a hallway filled with works. The entrance with an 18th century Venetian sofa, Charles James, voluptuous curving sort of sofa, and Yves Klein, a major Yves Klein painting, People Begin to Fly. Now there's a Brock, monumental Brock painting over the piano, an African sculpture. The dressing room that he did for Dominique, they painted the walls together in this soft kind of checkerboard. And this house was essential to the Dominio's mission in Houston, because they felt that there was a great letter that was written to a curator at the Museum of Modern Art when the Dominios gave a work to the museum, and they said, we want to do that when we can, but our generosity, but we're somewhat limited with you because we really have to concentrate on Houston, because here we're almost alone. They weren't alone. There were some other people who were collecting. It wasn't that there was nothing, but there wasn't a lot. And the Dominios were determined to do something about that. You get a sense of where they came from. You saw her family, you saw his family, and what he was interested in when they first became married, when they were first married. And they arrived in Houston, this very young city, and it had very little, and they took a look around and they said, let's do something about that. Let's make it better. Let's make it more interesting. And that engagement is something. This book is about Houston, the Dominios are about Houston, but it's about anyone who goes to a city, any city, and decides that it's their responsibility to make it better. This is what some people call a little potting shed that was downtown that is called rather grandly the Contemporary Arts Museum. So it was the Contemporary Arts Association, which was a young group that started in Houston in 1948. It was an all-volunteer group. And they put on some exhibitions that weren't particularly interesting. They weren't horrible, but they weren't particularly interesting. And then the Dominios get involved, and they start to be a little more interesting, sort of contemporary works in Houston collections. And then Jean Dominio becomes the chairman in 1950, and he says, we'll do a show, but we kind of want to do it our way. So at that point in 1950, they're building their house. They're just finishing the house. They've been collectors really for only 3, 4, 5 years. It's all still really new, so they're not the major collectors that they became at that point. But they said, we'll do a show, but we want to do it our way. And they decided to do a show of Vincent van Gogh. So they talk with the Museum of Modern Art. They get 2 important paintings from MoMA. They talk with the Metropolitan Museum. They get a Sunflowers. They get an incredible painting called the Portrait of Dr Gachet. That it was the only time it ever traveled from New York once it got there. The Dominios brought it down in a Pullman car from New York. They end up working with museums and curators and collectors around the world, and they sent what they estimated as 1,000 letters, and they managed to get 21 perfect little Van Gogh paintings, watercolors, and sketches down to Houston for an exhibition that began in February 1951. And it was far and away the most important cultural manifestation ever seen in the state of Texas. You know, there were 14,000 people who went through this exhibition in 3 weeks. You know, and it's fascinating to me on several levels. Number one, the Dominios, they didn't. We saw some of the works that they had in their house early. There was some Picasso. There was a Braque. I'm trying to think of some of the very early works. There were some surrealists already, but they didn't choose any of those artists. They chose Van Gogh because they felt that he was an artist who had tremendous impact on other artists. He was someone who wasn't recognized in his lifetime, and he felt that Van Gogh was an artist that would really, because there had been no exhibition in the South, there had only been one exhibition in New York, and they felt that it was someone who would get everyone's attention. And what's fascinating about this exhibition is from this first show, they said that if we're going to do something in Houston, it's going to be good not just for the city or good for the region or good for the state, but whatever we do, it has to be as good as anything in New York or London or Paris, that whatever we do, it has to be measured by international standards. And they did that from that first show until the day Dominique de Menil died. You know. This is an exhibition called Totems Not Taboo, which is 1959 at the Museum of Fine Arts in a building called Cullinan Hall by Mies van der Rohe. And it was what one architect friend of the Dominios called a big castrating space, because it was a huge gallery that was almost impossible to show works in because it tended to overwhelm them. And they worked very closely with a curator named Jerry McKagy. And Dominique and Jean Dominio were intensely involved in this, in finding the works of art and getting them here. And it was an exhibition of over 250 primarily African sculptures. They built structures inside the space, gravel, plants. The director of the Museum of Modern Art said that it was one of the 3 most exceptional exhibitions that he'd seen in his life. And there are so many things that are interesting about the show to me. But imagine a show of primarily African sculpture in the segregated South in 1959. It was an important social statement that they were making as well. This is Nina Cullinan, who's the patron who built Cullinan Hall, and here she is in her white gloves and pearls in the midst of all of these African sculptures. And it's a photograph by Eve Arnold that I think is just a great one. But the Stanley Marcus wrote to the president of the Museum of Fine Arts to congratulate him on Totems Not Taboo. He said, "I have seen primitive exhibitions all over the world, and nowhere have I seen one more beautifully or imaginatively mounted. Please extend my very sincere congratulations to Miss McKagy." And then the Neiman Marcus chairman sent a copy of the letter to John Dominio with a note, "And special congratulations to you, John, for I understand you are the one who made this possible." So filling up a sensational new piece of modern architecture with hundreds of objects, primarily from Africa, was a daring gesture in 1959. And the exhibition was an artistic act, of course, but it was also a social statement. And I want to conclude by just telling you a little about this. This is the Menil collection, a museum that Dominique built in 1987, that opened in June 1987 in Houston, designed by Renzo Piano. It was the first building he ever did on his own. It was interesting because she'd been looking for an architect for many years. She hadn't been able to find anyone. She met Renzo Piano in November 1980. She didn't want to meet him because she didn't like the Pompidou Center, she had co-designed. And she said to him at the beginning of the meeting, "I have to tell you, Monsieur Piano, that I don't like the Pompidou Center at all." And he said, "Okay." And, but at the end of that 45-minute meeting, she made a little note in her date book, "He's the one." She goes, "Everything is going to be done on in a very rigorous way." And I asked Renzo Piano, "How did that happen?" And he didn't really want to answer. And eventually I was like, "Look, I know Italian men are supposed to be charming, but what happened? 15 years she can't find an architect, and suddenly in 40 minutes she hires you, someone who'd never done a new building, never done a building in America." And he said, "I wasn't that charming. I wasn't very well dressed." He said, "I don't think we were drunk." He goes, "But actually," he said, "I think what it was is I wasn't too intelligent." He said, I didn't talk to her about grand theories of architecture. I didn't talk about, I didn't position myself as an artist." He said, "She already had the artist." He said, "I said I was a bâtisseur." He said, "The term bâtisseur in French is like, it's more than just a builder. It's really someone who's interested in the craft of building." He said, "So I told her that I was, what fascinated me was that I'm interested in the craft of building." And he said that's what she was looking for, someone who could interpret what she wanted. Because at that point she had worked in the museum world for more than 25 years. So she knew what she wanted in a museum. She needed someone who could interpret that. So this is the museum as it looked in 1987. It's a Chamberlain sculpture on the right. I know you guys have some here. Saw one earlier. Calder Mobile at the end. This is the long stairway. Black floors, just like the Dominio house. Light, these incredible louvers that Piano came up with that filter about 99% of the light. She wanted a dynamic light in there like she has at home. So if the sun goes behind the clouds, it changes the way you see a work of art. And this incredible eclectic collection of art of 10,000 objects that she and her husband had gathered over the decades. It begins with prehistoric, incredibly. On the left is a Neolithic bone carving. It's 15,000 works, 15,000 years old, 15,000 years BC, excuse me. It has a tremendous collection of non-Western, also built around atriums, much like the house. The most important collection of surrealist art in the world, including 80 paintings by Magritte, 95 paintings by Max Ernst. Here the walls are dark gray, the skylights are blocked out to create a sense of mystery, and a remarkable collection of 20th century and modern and contemporary art. Here we have the Brock that we saw over the fireplace, a major Miro, the Matisse that Dr. Barnes helped them understand, and a pair of Picasso. The dark floors, the light coming in, it's an extraordinary institution. These are these areas above that were called treasure rooms, because Dominique felt, it was said when the museum opened, I was just explaining that because she had worked in museums for so long, she understood, she had a different experience than many people who build a museum. And the conservation studio is downstairs, and it's open. It looks out onto a lovely little courtyard. The framing department is the same. It looks out onto the exterior of the building. All of these departments that are often shunted away into the basement. I understand that your conservation department is now given pride of place here. But at that point, it was very new. No one had ever seen that. The museum was called The Revenge of the Museum Professional when it first opened. And these are these fabulous rooms that she designed that are called treasure rooms, where she had the works of art when they weren't being shown. And I just want to conclude with a visit because the Dominios had an incredible appreciation for the artist. They believed that what mattered more than anything is artistic intention and the artist. The museum itself has no wall text. It has only the name of a work of art, the medium, the date, a donor if there is one. And the idea is that there's nothing that interferes with the way you experience a work of art. That it's just you in front of a work, and you decide how you feel about it. So the artist and the artistic act was something that they were fascinated in. They got to know many artists over the time of their lives, over the period of their lives, and they were fascinated by how they saw things. And 2 years after the museum opened, in 1989, Dominique went through the galleries with Frank Stella, an artist that she and John had collected since the 1960s. She noted in this note, she had like 4 pages of notes on this meeting. She said, medium-sized, wiry, swarthy complexion, gray and fluffy hair, dark eyes, constantly moving, intense gaze, quick gestures. The artist had already taken a look inside the museum. He said, you have a Ulysses, don't you? Stella asked Dominique about a major Barnett Newman painting. Stella wanted to go directly to the 20th century galleries on the east side of the building. Dominique noted that Stella walked by a large gray Cy Twombly without saying a word, and then stopped in front of Jasper John's Voice, a striking gray canvas and assemblage measuring 6 feet by 8 feet. Stella's only comment, for Jasper, this is a very large painting. They stopped in front of Stella's large gray canvas, Avicenna, a pattern of concentric dark gray lines around a rectangular white void. Quote, he contemplates his gray painting with obvious satisfaction, Dominique noted. Stella was standing so that he could see both his piece and Jasper John's gray alphabets from 1956. The artist told Dominique that they had become closer in tone than when they were first made, that his painting had become lighter and John's had darkened. Stella walked by works by Rauschenberg, mumbling pleasant comments, before coming face to face with Jasper John's star, a small, pale construction in oil beeswax and house paint of a Star of David. Stella gasped. How did you get it? He demanded of Dominique. I told her that Walter Hopps, who was the founding director of the Menil, I told her that Walter Hopps had kept track of it and grabbed it when it suddenly appeared on the market. It's a high point of the collection for him. They walked up to a pair of paintings by Barnett Newman. Stella looked at Newman's large, intense red canvas, B.I., with a thin white line that ran down the center, but he was particularly struck by Ulysses, the important abstract expressionist painting that had once belonged to Dominique's daughter, Christophe. Stella took a few steps back and looked intently at Ulysses. It is Newman at his best, he exclaimed to Dominique. He knew what he was doing when he painted Ulysses. He was almost ecstatic. It rises, yet it's dense. It's like a cathedral. Cathedrals are strong, but they seem weightless. He looked at it from a great distance and just said, it soars. Dominique and Stella continued their visit to the 20th century galleries. The artist studied her Mondrian paintings with an obvious interest and a Brancusi sculpture, which he felt would be better displayed in the middle of the gallery so they could be seen from all sides. Stella paid great attention to the Cubist paintings, but did not even glance at a Cézanne watercolor. As they walked back to the entrance of the museum, the artist told Dominique how much he loved the architecture of the building. He said that he expected it to be several stories tall and downtown, and that it was so refreshing to find that it was in a neighborhood and that it fit in so well. Quote, he likes everything about the museum, Dominique noted. The covered walks, the classical feeling, the chalk white walls. He is almost emotional about it, and he tries to press me on how good it is. He understands that I do understand how he feels, and our handshake has the warmth of an embrace. He hops in his car and is gone. So I'd love to hear from you. I'd love to know if you guys have any questions. It's a big book, but their lives were big. And so it's hard to cover anything, to do anything close to covering their lives in this time, but I'd love to know if you guys have any questions.
Hi, I'm really interested to know what their opinion on their influence in art was and in how they felt like they were steering art versus how they were just collecting, like how their influence was being manifested as collectors, not only just as museum curators. Thank you.
Well, they were they were also people. It sounds a little surprising for someone who would build a museum, but they were also people of tremendous humility. So I think they would never have said that they tried to influence anyone or that they wanted to influence. I think they did, but I don't think they would have ever admitted that. It was said that the house at one point, because she brought, before the museum was built, she brought curatorial staff to the house. She turned the garage into what was called a collection room. So they had all of these kind of registrars there, organizing the collection and doing curatorial work and receiving works of art and shipping them out. And it was said that it was like some well-concealed art power plant, you know? But I don't think that they would have ever seen themselves as having had, or wanting to have an influence, other than wanting to encourage people in Houston to be interested in art. There was a questionnaire, actually. I'm pretty sure that it came from the Dallas Museum of Art. It's not clear. It says DMA up there, and so I feel like it came from here, but it's not dated. And it was a questionnaire of, it had about 25 questions, and one of them was, are there any other contemporary collectors who inspire you? And she said, I admire anyone who buys for love,
Hi, my question is related to their collection of tribal art and non-Western art. And I'm wondering if John's tour around the world at 21 influenced that, or is it strictly the relationship with that type of art to the Surrealists, whom they admired so much?
Sure, that's a very good question. I think that his trip around the world was something that was important for his interest in that. They also were profoundly committed to civil rights and non-Western art, particularly African art, was connected to that drive. They started a project that I think is fascinating. In the early 60s, Dominique felt that blacks had been portrayed in a way that was much more noble than anyone had understood. So she worked with this James Johnson Sweeney, who was the director of the Museum of Fine Arts in Houston, a director that they had brought down to Houston. He had been the director of the Guggenheim, the most important art professional that the city had ever seen. They supported him, and they had him start to send letters to museums and collectors around the world asking for documentation of works in their collection that showed blacks, that depicted blacks. And they began to research it there, and then it became a little controversial maybe for the museum, and so the Dominios took it under their own wing. They opened an office in Paris, opened an office in Houston, and that project went on for 30 years. And it published, I believe, 5 volumes now is the final. It's called The Image of the Black in Western Art. And it documents how blacks have been depicted since Greco-Roman days. And it's a fascinating project, and that has a clear civil rights connection. So part of their interest was they were internationalists, they were humanists, and civil rights was a major area of interest for them.
Thinking in terms of coming to America and the American collector families they might have intersected with, I wondered if you ran into their intersection with the Vanderbilts or with the Guggenheims.
They knew Peggy Guggenheim. The Vanderbilts, I don't know of a connection. They knew Peggy Guggenheim. They saw her in Venice. They had Yolis was someone who sold to Peggy Guggenheim as well. Max Ernst knew Peggy Guggenheim very well. So there was a connection. At one point, they hoped that when James Johnson Sweeney was at the Museum of Fine Arts, that they were going to be able to get part of her collection there. That didn't happen. But they had collections, or they had connections with a lot of the later collectors, European collectors, and collectors in New York. But the earlier ones are because the Dominios are really collecting from 1945, let's say, until 1997. So that the second half of the 20th century is really when they were friendly with him. But no, she had tremendous relationships. She was very involved with the Pompidou Center. She started an organization called the American Friends of the Pompidou, and she would organize trips to Europe for supporters. And so many institutions now do art trips, but these seem to have been some of the first. And they're fascinating itineraries, that she would take a group of 20 people to Switzerland or to France, to Spain, and they would meet with, in the private homes of some of the most important collectors there. They would go to artists' homes, they would see studios, they would go to museums, of course. But there were collectors in Houston who were on those trips and who said that what was fascinating about it is that she never taught anyone, that she just kind of put you in front of great art and allowed you to decide what you thought, And she had a great influence on a whole generation of younger collectors in Houston and in New York as well.
Just a quick question.
Oh.
Did they ever come in contact with Wendy Reeves?
I don't know Wendy Reeves. Oh, no.
We have to give you a tour.
Oh, good. Oh, okay. Oh, okay. Oh,
They're about the same time, sort of.
okay. And she was here in Dallas?
Yes, she was a model in New York, and he was a publisher and friend of Churchill.
Okay.
And we have a sort of a replica of their home,
Okay.
which they purchased from Chanel, and their paintings are here.
Oh, wow. Okay, great. That's neat. No, I don't know. They did have quite a relationship with Stanley Marcus, who was obviously important for your institution. And in 1957, he and Jean chaired the American Federation of Arts, a meeting that was in Houston. There was a remarkable conference that Duchamp came down and gave a lecture that was really important in art history. And one day, it was really Jean Dominio who came up with this idea. They chartered a jet and they flew everyone. They did a day trip around Texas. They came up to Dallas. First they went to San Antonio, went to the McNay, and then they flew up here to Dallas. You had a choice of going to Dallas or Fort Worth, and then back to Houston, and all photographed by Cartier-Bresson. But he and Stanley Marcus were the two chair of that, and so I've seen a lot of correspondence with him.
Maybe your next book.
Maybe he was certainly fascinating. And I saw this Jackson Pollock here and it's fascinating to me. I had no idea that you had one that early. The Dominios gave a Jackson Pollock to the Museum of Fine Arts, Houston, in the 1960s, and it was the only Jackson Pollock in the collection until 1995 or something like that. And now they have some other drawings and some other works, but they also gave a Jackson Pollock to the Pompidou Center, and Walter Hopps, the founding director of the museum, said, I mean, who's given away a Jackson Pollock twice? he didn't like that. He wanted them.
Did they have any children?
Yes, they have 5 children, and each are very interesting figures in their own right, and very strong figures, and I have been able to get to know them over the years. It took a while to make them feel comfortable with the project, but I always say that if any of us were contacted by someone who said, I want to write a book about your parents, it would be, who is this person and what do they want to do? So I always felt it was my responsibility to make the family feel comfortable with the project. And over the years, they had read drafts and they have felt that it was a serious work. And so they are all quite positive right now. And in fact, the other day there was a lunch, and one of the children, Francois Dominio, was there, and I had to talk a little, and they asked him what he thought of the book, and he was positive, of course, but then he said, there's so much kind of correspondence from my parents and letters and everything. He said it's almost like they live again, and then he got choked up, and he couldn't continue.
Yeah, Oh, okay. It's just a question on the Rothko Chapel.
Mm-hmm.
Was that done after the museum opened up in Houston? And why did they build this?
Yeah, that's a very good question. In fact, our first event, the book just launched yesterday. Yesterday was the first day. This is the second event, you guys. And last night was at the Rothko Chapel. And talk about an emotional moment to be in that space, which was the first big project of the Dominios in Houston. It opened in 1971. And Adelaide Dominio, another of the children, was there, and she asked at one point when it came to questions, why Rothko? And I'm like, wait, if you don't know, how am I supposed to know? But the woman who curated that Totems Not Taboo exhibition, Jerry McKagy, whose husband Douglas McKagy was here in Dallas, at the Dallas Museum of Art, is that right? Okay. But Jerry McKagy was someone who was incredibly important for the Dominials, and she died early in 1964, and they wanted to do a memorial to her. She was very friendly with Rothko because she was from San Francisco, and so they thought that Rothko would be the right artist to select. And the Dominials had helped sponsor a small Basilian university in Houston called the University of St. Thomas, with this beautiful Philip Johnson campus. And at the end of the campus, there was supposed to be a chapel, a Catholic chapel. So they spoke with Mark Rothko. They also felt that his work was surprisingly spiritual, that the first time they went to his studio in the 1950s, they saw these paintings he had done for the Four Seasons in New York, and they felt like that they should walk softly and whisper, that there was kind of a spiritual element to these big abstract canvases. And so they went to him, and he had always been looking for a kind of total environment for his works, and so he accepted with pleasure, and they rented an amazing studio for him on 69th Street in New York. There was a former fire station. They rented that for years. They gave him the funds, and they left him alone, and they allowed him to do his work. His own production sort of plummeted during those years. He really focused on the Rothko Chapel paintings, and the canvases are difficult. They're big and they're dark, and it's an octagonal building. Philip Johnson was supposed to design the exterior, and then there was kind of a falling out with the artist, and the Dominials, of course, sided with the artist, and so they hired their architect in Houston to kind of finish it. But it's really based on Rothko's design. The exterior is very simple, but Dominique felt strongly that she wanted to allow him to have his vision, and she felt also that the darkness of the paintings was perfect for that kind of environment. Her first reaction was somewhat disappointed. She expected brighter colors, but brighter colors would probably not make that much sense in an environment where you're supposed to go and meditate and sort of, enter into these works. So she was very strong in her defense of the darkness of the chapel paintings. That tells you a little about it. There's a whole chapter.
Hi, my question is about the DeMilles and their role as tastemakers for architecture in Houston. I'm an architectural historian, and I focus on architecture of Dallas in the 20th century. And it's been my opinion that Houston has always been a little bit more avant-garde as far as architecture and accepting new architecture, particularly in the 20th century, compared to Dallas, who's had a more traditional taste. And I'm wondering what you think the DeMille's role might have been and how much influence they might have had on that, and if you think my statement's true or not.
Okay, sure. Well, first of all, the building of the house was the first major statement that they made, and it was not only building an international style house. The architecture of the house is fine. It's not amazing. It's not as strong as the glass house. It's fine, but that they also chose to have this interior that was completely different, and they chose to add this incredible collection of art, made it a remarkable statement for the city of Houston. But they sponsored great architecture. There's the University of St. Thomas. They built these little buildings at Rice that were called the Art Barn, that were kind of like Frank Gehry, kind of tin structures that were. It was the Art Institute of Rice, but it was referred to as the Art Barn because they looked like two barns on this very kind of classical campus. The decision to hire Mies van der Rohe for the MFA was partly influenced by the Dominials, and they knew Mies van der Rohe and they worked with him. So they had a big influence on the kind of architectural direction of the city. Now, there were others there, like Gerald Hines is a great example, who hired Philip Johnson and ended up doing incredible buildings with him. The only thing I would say is that Houston is such a jumble of a city that maybe it doesn't follow the same rules as something like Dallas. There's a little more desire to experiment than Dallas, which is more classical. But I know the Dominios definitely had an influence on that. I mean, they were definitely influential in encouraging patronage of modern architecture. There are many modern houses that were done after the Dominio's house. It's an incredible collection of kind of mid-century architecture in the city that's not that well known. Some is disappearing, unfortunately, but a lot of it was done by architects who were inspired by what the Dominios had done.
Is the house still standing?
It is actually, and about 10 years ago, it underwent a $3.5 million renovation, and it is still part of the Menil Foundation. The institution has not fully understood how to use it yet, it seems to me. You can't have large groups there because it's in River Oaks, it's in the center of River Oaks, and so you can't really have, you can have the occasional event, but you can't have big groups there. So it's an adjunct of the museum right now, but they haven't quite decided how they're best going to use it. Someone suggested that it be used as to house the director, which I think would be an excellent idea. You know, it should be used as it was. You know, it was a living. One of the things it's one of the things I like the most about the book. There's a chapter on the house, good for our architectural historian here, that talks about the architecture, the interior design, the art, and then it goes through about 3 or 4 decades of how the house was used. All of the events that went on there, all of the people who came down, the artists who came down, the entertaining that they did, because that's what makes the whole place, what gives the whole place its power, I think. It's not just the architecture, it's not just the interior design, it's all of this together, you know, and when you understand that, you have a better sense of what makes this house so magical. That other part is not there right now. You know, it doesn't really have the life that it did. It doesn't have as layered a collection of art as it did. So it doesn't quite have it's beautiful, but it doesn't quite have the power that it once did. One final question? No, that's it? Okay, wait.